welcome back to the Battle for China essays on the military history of the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945. So let's continue from last time. Aiding and abetting Japanese subversion and intimidation of Chinese officials in North China was a campaign of economic warfare carried out by the Japanese field armies in those provinces as a part of a program to dominate the region economically as well as politically. One of the most injurious elements of this effort was the smuggling of cheap goods into North China, particularly along the coast, in order to evade Chinese tariffs. Because the nationalist government simply had too few men to staff its customs stations, this activity, which the Japanese euphemistically termed a special trade, often flourished openly and brazenly. In Hebei province, such smuggling was carried out with the tacit approval of the Kuomintang army. Not to be outdone in this shadowy enterprise, the Japanese Navy gave protection to smuggling operations based in Taiwan and carried out along the south coast. So one thing you could notice from this, let's say, let's see a provincial map of China for the 1930s. So based on this administrative division, you can see the map. I'm not sure actually if there is a map of Hebei proper. I guess this counts as Hebei, right? This pink region. As you can see, like the borders here, the borders of this pink region are quite large, and since the Chinese had to retreat from this region, smuggling along this region would be quite easy because this is quite an extensive border, opposed to when Chinese had control of this region and only had to guard this small border against the north, against Rehe or Zhehou. So this smaller border with established customs and everything were forced to retreat. Since the party organ, the military had to retreat from this pink region, Hebei entirely, the task has become a lot more difficult for customs to guard this region. Furthermore, as you can see in the south, the Japanese are infiltrating Chinese coasts from the south and trying to do illegal trade activities there. So it's getting interesting. The special trade had a number of serious consequences for China. It badly undermined the authority for the nationalist government in those provinces where it was carried out. Just as serious, it substantially weakened Chinese customs revenues, which in previous years had provided the central government with almost half its income. So just earlier I was reading a little bit on Wikipedia also that a lot of Chinese investment comes from Japan. So this is very heavy, like China seems to be heavily involved in trade with Japan during the 1930s. And also on top of that, you have the global depression caused by the depression of 1929, the United States, the stock market crash. And then you have, on top of that, one of the top trade partners, Japan, basically bypassing your custom duties, where it's half of your revenue. The situation becomes quite serious. Further, the smuggling trade injured legitimate business in North China. As a consequence, in a number of cases, failed Chinese businesses were quickly bought up by the Japanese, thus tightening Japan's economic grip on the region. With the weakening of Chinese economic institutions in North China, the Japanese military, particularly the North China Garrison Army, advanced schemes for the exploitation of resources and markets of the region. So remember, one of the primary goals of Japanese interests in China is economic advancement, because this is really this is a problem for Japan. Japan's economy has a huge problem. And if they can accomplish these economic goals without war, that is also quite good. Inevitably, these Japanese economic inroads added to the rising tide of anti-Japanese feeling in the country, heralded by a wave of protests in the Chinese press. In this popular crisis, Wang Jingwei, as foreign minister and chief of the executive yuan, executive yuan is kind of just the executive branch of the government, and Wang Jingwei is a seasoned political official and person in the nationalist government. He's quite senior. Yeah, he's second. I think he was like basically very close to the status of Sun Zhongshan, who was the basically the father of the republic, the Chinese Republic, and politically he is quite favored. But Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi holds military power, and they have this compromise situation where Wang Jingwei holds political power, while Jiang Jieshi holds military power. So he took the public criticism while Chiang Kai-shek endeavored to stay out of the spotlight. He's kind of a low, and Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek is kind of a low-end guy. He's not very out there, not in the beginning of the 1930s, and he's kind of secretive about his dealings. Only by threatening to resign along with a number of other Kuomintang leaders was Wang able to compel Jiang to share the burden of public anger at the current policy of appeasement. Because really, Jiang is this guy. He's making all the military decisions to retreat from these regions. He is making all the deals and saying, let's draw our troops away from the Hebei region to appease the Japanese and divert them to fight the Chinese communists. So he should share a good chunk of the blame, if not all of it. Then in October 1935, after an attempt on his life, Wang was hospitalized and obliged to relinquish his governmental and party posts. So this is quite interesting. I mean, obliged is very because, was he really like, is he really so sick that he can't do his? I mean, I think he was probably threatened. In this new situation, Chang is obliged to assume all public responsibility for the government's relations with Japan. Stubbornly, however, he clung to his policy of pacification before resistance. I think he sort of has a grasp on the public opinion, but he thinks that a war with Japan would be more disastrous to him than losing the public support. For the time being, Chiang's ability to sustain this policy continued to rest on a careful balance of political interest in China, particularly with those lesser but powerful military figures, the regional warlords like Feng Yuxian and Yan Xishan. But among those, Zhang Xueliang, still smarting over Chiang's decision not to contest the Japanese invasions of Manchuria and Zhehou, was a potentially disruptive military figure. So remember, Zhang Xueliang is the son of someone who was mentioned earlier in the assassination. If I just go up here. Sorry. I think it was Zhang Zuolin. Sorry, this search engine is being not very fast here. So you see here that this guy, who was the warlord of Manchuria, was essentially assassinated. So he was assassinated in 1928, and the reason he was assassinated was actually because the Japanese wanted to instigate. Oh wait, but why is this page 60? That's a bit too far ahead. Sorry, so earlier we definitely read that he was assassinated. Actually, it wasn't far ahead. It was just fine. Hold on. Jeez. Hoping to create a chaotic situation that would force the high command in Tokyo to authorize the Kuomintang army to occupy the region. So he was assassinated as a part of a Japanese plot to take over northern China, which succeeded. And his son, Zhang Xueliang, wanted help to resist the Japanese, and didn't get any help from Jiang Jieshi, essentially, and he had to flee from the field with his field troops because he alone was not strong enough. He didn't want to resist the Japanese because if he did, he'll lose a good chunk of his units and be significantly weakened to the extent where both the Japanese and the Central Chinese army can basically just destroy him immediately. So he's in an extremely bad position. But remember, now that the public is against Chiang Kai shek or Jiang Jieshi, he is able to make these political demands or these influence of opinion that Jiang do something. Politically, the people are sort of with him. So, recognizing this and seeking to forestall any rash move by Zhang to strike at the Japanese and create a conflict that Jiang could not control, Jiang appointed Zhang as the chief of the anti-communist headquarters at Xi'an, Henan provinces, essentially, giving him something to do, keeping him occupied, and hoping he doesn't do anything rash. Jiang obviously believed that this assignment would both isolate Zhang and compel him to participate in Jiang's campaign against the communists and helping him see the light, right? Crushing the communists is more important than beating Japanese at the moment because China is not strong enough to resist Japan. That's his opinion. He's trying to make Zhang see that. It was to be a fateful and mistaken decision for Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek. One would make Zhang Xuan'ang a pivotal figure in the dramatic redirection of Chinese policy. So this is a very famous incident. We'll let this play out. Throughout 1935, the two Japanese field armies in China continued their machinations, interference, and intimidation for the purpose of destabilizing nationalist authority in North China and pressuring Chinese officials and regional warlords like Song Zheyuan to join in a Japanese-dominated autonomy movement. I think Song Zheyuan was up north, like he's around these regions here, where he has some influence. The communists are here in Shanxi, and then in Shanxi, I think Song Zheyuan is around here, and then Yan Xishan is like here in Shanxi. So you have these warlords, these political parties in China. The chief instigator of these activities was Colonel Doihara of the Mukden Special Service Organ. The range and audacity of the provocations of Doihara and his associates of the Kuomintang Army are remarkable. The arrest of Kuomintang officials on Chinese territory, particularly Peking and Tianjin, by Japanese military police. So remember, the arrangement was for the Chinese to withdraw all of their military and also their KMT party organs from this region, but that didn't mean that Japanese troops could stay there. They also had to withdraw on their own timetable. But apparently they're just willy-nilly randomly arresting people there with their own authority somehow now. The Japanese demands that Nanjing suppress all anti-Japanese sentiments in the press throughout the country. So, this is no longer just about the North. Japan wants to control Chinese press, which it just doesn't make sense really, because controlling another nation's press essentially means that nation has lost its autonomy. Unannounced provocative flights by Japanese military aircraft over Peking and Tianjin, marshalling of large numbers of Japanese troops along the border of Hebei province, and a host of other lesser provocations. So they are not respecting the demilitarized agreement, and also they are not respecting any sort of international law, essentially. In these endeavors, the two Japanese field armies are blind to the realities and consequences of their actions. Convinced that they were themselves fighting communism and corruption in China, they were in fact arousing hatred by the Chinese masses. This is an interesting idea that they think they are fighting communism and corruption because they are fighting the nationalist government, which was in charge, nominally at least, of those areas. The communists were not in charge of Hebei in the areas of instigation. The communists are in charge of this blue region, Shanxi. They're not in charge of this region at all, where they instigated this. This is Beijing, this is Tianjin. So they are not in charge here at all. So I don't see how they can make that excuse, really. If Doihara and his superiors had believed that these measures would soon bring about the collapse of Chinese resistance to Japanese efforts to dominate North China, they were soon disabused of that notion. By the end of 1935, their outrage had ignited a powder keg of public anger. The National Salvation Movement, which found its voice in the burgeoning student demonstrations and massive protests calling for an end to China's civil war and for nationwide resistance to Japanese aggression. So this has become a movement, basically um, sparked by Japanese their own doing. The situation has reached a boiling point where neither the central Japanese nor Chinese government could control it. You're starting to see the tension bubbling up from the civilians into the military, into the government. The scale and intensity of this national outburst had several important consequences. To begin with, although Chiang Kai-shek had drawn into his own hands unprecedented military and political power in the past half-decade, his room for maneuver and accommodation in pursuit of his Fabian policy of delay towards Japan was all but now eliminated. So he's basically played all of his cards. He's tried to push Wang Jingwei to take all his responsibility. He's retreated as far as he can into the interior of China and giving Japan as much gains as possible. But the Japanese military does not seem to be happy enough with that. And he can't retreat any further without just risking the complete embarrassment of his government. Similarly, the regional warlords on China's northern borders fronting Japanese occupied territory no longer had the option of further concessions towards Japan lest their own military forces rebel or defect. And so those regional warlords can't lose any more land to Japan, because if they do, they don't exist anymore. That's all their territory. So for Japanese, so they no longer have the option of cooperating with the Japanese without really losing all of their power. And the Japanese side, I sense, are not seeing all these details in Chinese politics, because when you're strong, you don't think about how the weaker side has their internal setup. Like, you're not compelled to, at least. And Japanese were, I feel like, certainly lazy on this front. They didn't quite bother to think about the situation of Chinese internal politics and how that would lead to a eventual confrontation with Japan. Or at least the Japanese army did not. Maybe the Tokyo government did. For Japanese, the spasm of Chinese national hostility came as a rude shock. The hardline extremists in the Guangdong and North China area armies were now confronted with the failure of their policy of manipulation and intimidation of regional Chinese leaders to achieve Japanese domination of North China. I think they went about this the wrong way. They were way too harsh and way too fast. And they gave the Chinese warlords and the national government essentially no choice. So that's essentially nationalists, the Japanese military not being good diplomats, which is completely not surprising. That's not what they're supposed to be. Faced with the prospect of enormous street protests and newly obdurate Chinese regional leadership resisting both threats and blandishments, Japanese field commanders now had to choose between abandoning their dreams of controlling North China's reliable Chinese clients or simply resorting to violence and crushing all Chinese resistance by force. So it's come to that. At this juncture, late 1935, moderates in the Tokyo High Command belatedly intervened to rein in the strong arm strategies of Colonel Doihara and his colleagues in the field. So I'm actually not sure how much power he has. He should be just a colonel. But then again, he is in the intelligence service, so maybe that makes him a lot more powerful than, say, like a random colonel in the army. Maybe someone up high has recognized him. Recognizing that his schemes and the provocative activities of the field armies have failed to achieve their purpose, the Army's General Staff ordered them halted. Oh, this is interesting. This is the Army General Staff. This is not actually even coming from the politicians. Ordered them halted and recalled Doihara in semi-disgrace. So he failed to achieve his goals, and he escalated tensions, caused the warlords to, basically their partners potential partners in North China, to turn against Japan, which is completely unexpected. There's no room for negotiation. Taking advantage of this pause in Japanese pressure, Nanjing, after a intense round of negotiations with Japanese field commanders worked out an arrangement that established a semi-autonomous Hebei Changhar political council to be headed by Song Zheyuan. The council will retain a significant degree of national authority in the two provinces. So as you can see, Changhar is this like Changhar. This is the region, blue region. Hebei is like this pink region. So this portion, these two regions now have a political council with significant nationalist representation on it. There are, however, as well other developments that delay the progress of Japanese belligerence in China. Excuse me. The first of these was the humiliating collapse of the Kuomintang Army's territorial schemes. Throughout 1936, Japan has been able to exploit a string of minor but recurrent Chinese provocations for short-term tactical advantage, but to Japan's long-term strategic detriment. So this is basically essentially all of Japan's foreign policy being dictated by military people. Then in November of that year, Kuomintang Army adventurism in Inner Mongolia backfired. Trying once again to gain secure borders for Manchukuo, the Kuomintang Army staff-backed an anti-Chinese Inner Mongolian separatist movement. So this is mostly spearheaded by like the Mongolians, but also a little bit spearheaded by the Japanese, but there's also a little bit of support coming from the Mongolians as well. The Kuomintang Army supplied a Mongolian prince with weapons, equipment, and Japanese advisors expecting to carve out yet another autonomous region. So I think this is actually the second Japanese puppet in China, because the first one is Manchukuo or Manchukuo, and then Mengjiang, which is like here is the second Japanese puppet. Manchukuo is this one up here. Within the week, however, nationalist forces smashed the invasion and drove the Japanese and their puppet forces ignominiously from Suiyuan. I think Suiyuan is like around here. Oh, it's actually right here. So they drove him out of this region and probably forced him back into Changhar, which is quite surprising, quite decent. The Japanese government, humiliated by the reckless initiative of its field army, attempted to cover it by denying any official Japanese involvement in the debacle. So this is quite funny because the field army thought, hey, let's just take some territory on our own, supply some people. This is sort of like a Bay of Pigs invasion scenario. And it just worked horribly. And of course, without coordination with the government didn't know how to, like, if this even happened or how to supply them or help them militarily. They just got crushed. The Young Officers' Rebellion of 1936 and a return to a Tokyo-directed China policy. So I think we're about to see a major change in Japanese policy where finally the young officers take over and the government becomes a militarist junta. Setbacks on the Asian continent were not the only elements altering the direction and pace of Japanese policy in China. Because remember, Japan had been a democracy earlier in the 1920s, and as you enter, like, I think the 1930s, it becomes more and more problematic. Prominent political figures are assassinated. The country becomes militarist. Right-wing figures take over. Centrally becomes a military-controlled situation. Even more important was a sudden shift in early 1936 in the pattern of political and military power in Tokyo away from civilian and military extremists and back into the hands of less ideological, more cautious officers and officials. I was not expecting that. It is true the right-wing elements and disaffected company grade officers in Japan staged a series of assassinations and attempted coup d'etat between 1931 and 1936. There's absolutely no evidence, however, that such extremists were ever in any position of direct influence in the making of Japanese China policy by either the civilian government or the armed services during these tumultuous years. Ooh. Really? I mean, it seems like they were responsible for quite a few border instigations. And I don't think they had approval of the Japanese high command for that, especially like in the 1935 incursion. If you go back up here, I think, the Kuomintang Army provoked a number of violent incidents. And I think somewhere it said earlier that Japanese government had not much. They had intermittent control. Somewhere up here, they said the Japanese government had intermittent control of its own army, which doesn't make much sense. Yeah. So I guess the Foreign Office had an intermittent role, but the military high command still had control. I'm getting that that's the idea. But there were high-ranking officials, particularly in the army, who were known to bear sympathy towards their ideologically zealous subordinates, and who, in order to advance their own careers and agendas, were ready to make their support overt should some dramatic occasion arise. Okay, so they're using these young officers, hot-blooded officers whose political or military ideologies as their tools, and they're just letting them do what they want and see how far they get. They don't mind. The denouncement of this military radicalism was the 26 February 1936 incident, a mutiny by radicalized officers of the Army's 1st Division. The 1st Division will be important in the attack on China later. I think they are going to be attacking along one of the two major railroads up north, either the Jinghan Railroad, which goes from Beijing to Wuhan, I think. So probably going down here. So probably like this railroad. And then another one, which is like the from Tianjin to Qingdao, like this railroad here. So like the Army's 1st Division and 2nd Division will go along these two railroads to essentially attack China. So yeah, they will later play a big role. Within a few days, their hopes crumbled before the angry denunciations by the emperor and the obdurate hostility of the mainstream army leaders who suppressed rebellions. So notice they occupied buildings near the imperial palace, but didn't bother or didn't dare to go near the imperial palace itself. The emperor's authority is beyond politics, and they know this. There followed a sweeping purge of the rebel supporters and sympathizers in the army, particularly from among its higher echelons, opening the way for takeover of key general staff positions by officers committed to innovation, modernization, and renovation in the army. Oh, interesting. So because of these, the 1st Division is also considered an elite Japanese division. I think it's within the top 10 or 20 most elite divisions in Japan. And these guys were purged, basically. So now there's spots for other people to take over. Henceforth, responsible officers and civilian officials, not wild-eyed ideologues, hot-headed junior officers, nor the members of a single political party dictatorship made major Japanese policy decisions regarding China from 1937 to 1945. Well, this is extremely interesting because how this coup or this attempt affected policy is by emptying out the Japanese leadership of these hotheads who all got purged. Nor indeed was Japanese military policy in China initiated by Japanese field armies, now kept under careful watch by the high command in Tokyo, so the army ministry and the army general staff were still run by dissension and conflicting viewpoints about the China situation. In short, the suppression of young officers' revolt did not steer Japan onto a collision course for war with China. Oh, this is actually extremely interesting because I always thought it was the other way around, where they had a coup and they succeeded in influencing Japanese policy. The spring of 1937, the redirection of Japan's China policy and China's turn to war. In the spring of 1937, a sudden and surprising shift came about the strategic priorities of the Japanese army. The origins of the shift lay in the emergence of the 1930s of a powerful Soviet military presence in Northeast Asia. So, as you might know, the Soviet Union established their own puppet government in Outer Mongolia, or this yellow region. And as you know, the Japanese are trying to establish their own puppet in this region here in Manchukuo. So it's also in Chahar. So they are doomed to have some border skirmishes and issues later on as they try to fight over influence in this northeast China region. This new development rapidly altered Japanese army perspectives on China. Also, as you know, like the Japanese hate communists, so the Soviets are definitely not going to have agreements with them so early. Some officers in Tokyo High Command, like Colonel Ishibara, now argued for Japanese policies that encourage not sorted Chinese unity. So this is interesting because as the centralization of the Tokyo government, as well as military structure hierarchy, people started to turn and try to make deals with a unified China, encourage a unified China. In this new outlook, the former policy of divide and rule North China was to be discarded, and all sordid and selfish maneuverings and other acts of imperialist aggression in China avoided. See, they're starting to go about this through the more manipulative manner, playing the long game, trying to be friendly, I guess. Only by bringing China into cooperative relationships through a policy of benevolence, Ishihara argued, could Japan really prepare for a confrontation with the Soviet Union. Okay, that's interesting, but mostly, this is one view. Let's see if there's some other views. Others disagreed, of course. The Army senior leadership remained seriously divided over its China policy. So Ishihara says, let's forget about China. Let's try to be friendly towards them. Stop the escalations that were intermittently going on. Since the occupation of Manchuria, we have occupied this Chahar, and we also instigated incidents in this Hebei province, and we also even had this instance in this orange region where the Chinese drove us out of Suiyuan. So let's stop all of that, try to deal with China as a serious political entity, and focus our attention on the Soviet Union up north, which is a reasonable, coherent political position. But there was a formidable group of hardliners on the general staff, some located ironically in Ishihara's operations division, in the Army Ministry, and in the Guangdong and China garrison armies that constituted a powerful and intransigent voice in the shaping of the Army's China policy. These hogs had no compunction about using force against China and thought any coddling of China would be injurious to Japanese military prestige and only encouraged Chinese intransigence. Besides, they argued, if past experience was any guide, the Chinese would quickly collapse once actual fighting began. Okay, so they are guided by their policy thinking from the 1930s, where they drove the Chinese essentially out of Manchuria, which again is the size of Germany, and they continued to establish a demilitarized zone, force the Chinese army to retreat from their own country in Hebei. So basically, they think this will just keep on happening. Theirs was still a powerful and intransigent voice in shaping of Japan's China policy. So this is quite a lot of people on the general staff, so seemingly much higher up than our Colonel Ishihara. But this is not just him. There are some officers in high command, so they're backing him. He himself also being on the high command. Drafted principally by the General Staff, the Army's latest war plans under 1936 revision to national defense policy now reviewed North China as a strategic rear area in the event of operations against the Soviet Union. So, I mean, if you're using this as a base area, you must have good relations near China, so when the Soviet Union and Japan are in conflict, nationalist China doesn't come and stab Japan in the back, because they will be fighting a two-front war. Also, they want to pacify the populace so that the populace will be happy to supply Japanese with a abundant economy and not sabotage them. It was assumed that as long as the Kuomintang remained weak and China divided, the prospects for full-scale war with the nationalists were unlikely. Okay. So essentially, Ishihara, this group didn't win, right? Because they wanted Chinese unity, but the actual Japanese policy is not that. It's a weakened China still, a divided China. So again, so they still had internal conflicts to resolve. To maintain that situation, it was critical that frictions and incidents in China be avoided if possible. So their policy is make China big, but don't engage with them for now. If anti-Japanese outbreaks in North China did occur, the Tokyo High Command wanted them contained. And as the nationalist government has yielded so many times in the past in their negotiations with Japan, it's quite reasonable for Japan to say, hey, stop these anti-Japanese incidents where they are harming Japanese citizens in China, and China will probably be forced to oblige. In early 1937, the General Staff had formally declared that its China policy was to be one of promoting mutual assistance and co-prosperity, and of the abandonment of plans to separate North China from nationalist control. Also, this is a formal declaration. It might be slightly different internally speaking. For its part, the Army Ministry now called for the dissolution of Japanese puppet regime in East Hebei. Already in the March of the previous year, the cabinet of Prime Minister Hirota Koki had adopted a conciliatory policy in its recognition of unified China and its opposition to diplomatic coercion under the threat of military force. Interesting. One does not need to endow Hirota Ishiwara or other like-minded Japanese figures of influence and authority with an aura of overnight clairvoyance or benevolence to recognize that the new course they proposed was the only China policy, short of a sudden and complete abandonment of Japanese presence in China that retained even a shred of common sense in the July of 1937. So July of 1937 is when the Sino-Japanese War actually starts. So, yeah. Whether the Army new obsession with Soviet threat was also rational must be subject of a different study. So for this threat to actually be real, we also probably need to look at the Soviet side. But I wonder if this book will delve into what the Soviet intelligence and the Soviet plans were for Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. At all events, as Edward J. Drea makes clear in Chapter 4, the Japanese Army's de-emphasis on preparations for the possibility of military operations in China was matched by a significant increase in Japanese troop strength along the Manchurian-Soviet border. Even Japanese units in North China were instructed to undertake training programs directed towards a mastery of tactics deemed necessary to deal with the imminent possibility of operations against a Russian enemy. In this new perspective, too many in the Tokyo High Command, a possible war with China was regarded as an irritating distraction to be dealt with summarily since the Chinese were without military capability, but to be avoided if possible. Yeah, so once again, they don't really care about North China. Right now they're turning against the Soviet Union. But in China, the pace of growing national fury at Japanese aggression had at last overtaken these belated Japanese steps to halt the slide to war. So interesting, up until 1936, the Japanese were provoking China, but with this coup, Japan purged its faction and turned to a more anti-Soviet foreign policy, turning away. But China now, having had enough, are about to maybe do some nationalist sentiments and instigate some things. To a great extent, developments in China in 1936 to 1937 caused the nation's Japan policy to spin out of the hands of Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi. True, Jiang still held as his central policy priority the consolidation of his power and the elimination of communists, the last overt challenge to his authority. From Jiang's perspective, the National Salvation Campaign and the demands for a frontal assault against the Japanese presence in China were dangerously premature. So he was in no position to make further concessions affecting China's sovereignty. He could and did strike at those heading the national protest movement, arresting some and threatening others. Okay, so he's trying to suppress this political movement. Such repressive tactics only increased the fires of public anger. So interesting that there was actually so much space in China for political demonstrations and maneuvering and changing of foreign policy that actually arresting these people didn't stop them. It actually made it worse. Ominously for Jiang, Zhang Xueliang and Yang Hucheng, appointed by Jiang as commanders of the anti-communist headquarters at Xi'an, now publicly voiced their support for the National Salvation Movement, so they completely turned against him. Alarmed, Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek flew to Xi'an in December 1936 to demand that Zhang and Yang support him in his final drive to wipe out the communists in their remote base in Shanxi province. So, he's like, "What are you guys doing?" So he flew there to see them in Xi'an. I think is about here. Oh yeah, it's here, but its own name I think is Chang'an. It's quite an old historical city, many names. So he flew there to see you guys and basically say, "Hey, what are you guys doing? Stop this." But his two commanders have had enough. Their earlier efforts against the communist enclave had failed, and they had less to fear from Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi than they had from the furnace of national indignation. Because they are national leaders in the north, remember, where the Japanese are essentially taking over the whole region, and they risk losing all of their military and political power if they lose all their holdings in the north. In addition, the people are furious because Japanese took all this land, all of Manchuria, as well as a lot of Hebei. So they're not in a good position right now. Misjudging the situation, Jiang just walked into a hornet's nest. Arriving in Xi'an, he was suddenly arrested by his two hosts, who presented him with a number of demands before he could be set free. Chief among those was Jiang's public support for the National Salvation Movement, which he previously suppressed and arrested, an end to the civil war against the communists, and the redirection of Nanjing's Japan policy towards national resistance. With little choice, Jiang agreed to those terms. So now it's China's turn for its government to be decentralized and for its generals to dictate foreign policy. With little choice, Jiang agreed to these terms. Zhang Xueliang had set Jiang free, released news of the agreement, and accompanied Jiang back to Nanjing to the tumultuous acclaim of cheering crowds. Ooh, didn't know that. For its part, the National Salvation Association welcomed Jiang's return to power and joined with the Communist Party in calling for a united front against the Japanese occupier. So I didn't know the public opinion turned so quickly towards Jiang's favor, and basically said, as long as you resist the Japanese, we are in favor of you. The die was now cast, though the Japanese army may have been slow to realize it. Tug of war between Tokyo and Nanjing over North China appeared no longer amenable to negotiations or compromise. It is hard to see how war could have been avoided in 1937, or at least within the next several years. In this, there is great and tragic irony. The tragedy in the drift to war in China and Japan in the spring of 1937 is that of an incongruence in the perceptions and timing of the policies of the two countries. Japan essentially were just about to cool down. While Japan, for reasons that may have been entirely self-interested and delusional, was prepared now to moderate its near half-century of aggression in China, its change of attitude was half a century too late. The nationalist regime, understandably endowed with 50 years of indignation, now began to assume an increasingly adamantine, vengeful, and uncompromising stand against Japan. The spark set off outside Peking on the night of July 7, 1937, was much like those numerous minor military frictions in the Sino-Japanese relationship in the past that have been quickly extinguished through negotiation. So this is interesting because this small skirmish is really no different from those skirmishes in the past which have been negotiated and settled. Of course, at the loss of Chinese territory. But now it's about to get a whole lot worse. But this time it could not be doused through compromise and fanned by national determination of an aroused people. It burst into flame. So it's too late. Japan had made too many mistakes, political and military mistakes in the past, and war is about to begin. Part 2, the two armies on the eve of war. So this is beyond political negotiation. As you can see, both sides, especially the Chinese side, are beyond any sentiment for the national sentiment is extreme at this point. And on top of that, you add a military skirmish. So we're going to see how that escalates into a full-blown war between China and Japan in the spring of 1937, as we will see soon. Okay, thanks for listening. I think that'll be all for today.